Welcome to our 2021 George Bain Memorial Lecture. A few of you will be aware that Groam House Museum was opened in 1980 to display the fabulous early Christian Pictish cross slab that, 1300 years ago, stood in Resmarkie at the heart of the major bishopric of Northern Pictland. It, along with 20 or so other sculptured stones from this highly significant Pictish site, are renowned. Their geometric, zoomorphic and figurative designs continue to fascinate many. A major detailed study of all known early Christian monuments of Scotland and their designs was produced by Allen and Anderson in 1903. Then, in the 1940s, George Bain, head of art at Kirkcaldy High School, produced a series of booklets based on his art class lessons. They gave an alternative approach to understanding how the intricate designs could be produced. His subsequent book, Celtic Art, Methods of Construction, was first published in 1951 and is still in print. In that publication, George Bain explains how to draw knotwork, spirals, key pattern, and other designs, and suggests how they might be applied by artists and craftspeople in the 20th century. He shows examples that include the Pictish sculpture at Resmarkie, as well as illuminated manuscripts, such as the Book of Kells, and illustrates various ways in which he and his students have used them. In the 1990s, about 25 years after his death, the Bain family started to look for a home for his large archive of work. George Bain had strong connections with the Inverness area, and through the hard work of our curator at that time, Susan Serrite, Groam House Museum was seen as an ideal place. By 2010, over 3,000 items had been moved north, at least 1/3 of them being associated with Bain's studies of Celtic art. In 2013, the George Bain collection became one of a select band of Scottish museum collections to be recognised as being of national significance by the Scottish Government. With such an accolade came both opportunities and responsibilities. These have been fully embraced, and one element has been that, since then, we've organised an annual or biennial lecture to celebrate George Bain's work. Today, with a major grant from Museums Galleries Scotland, we're currently working on a project to share George Bain's Celtic artwork with people around the world, both interested individuals and professional practitioners via the web. The website has recently gone live with the first tranche of content, but there's much more to come. We'll be adding the link to the chat bar so you can explore it further, or you can visit our Groam House Museum website and you'll find the link there. The site not only includes his drawings and sketches, but also his craftsmanship and that of his family and students. There are leather and wooden objects, knitting and embroidery, painted ceramics and metalwork, as well as designs for rugs and plaques. All use individually created interlace, knotwork, key pattern and related Celtic designs. The adaptation of Celtic art continues in contemporary craftsmanship, and it is this aspect that we've chosen for our George Bain lecture, with the spotlight on knitting. George Bain created numerous knitting charts. His daughter Claire knitted 2 jumpers using his Celtic designs. They're in the collection. And we know that there were others. But this innovative application of Celtic art has been developed further by one of today's foremost knitting designers. And I'm going to pass over to Helen Avenel, our museum advisor, to introduce her. Helen.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Jill, for that wonderful introduction to Groam House and to tonight's talk. So I'm delighted to be able to introduce our speaker tonight, Lucy Hague. Lucy's a contemporary artist who creates incredible work in wool and yarn. Lucy grew up in Orkney, on the Orkney Islands, and learnt to knit as a child, although it's only as an adult that she picked up her needles again, and since 2015 has been creating wonderful work with knitting at the centre. She describes her passion for designing engaging, intricate patterns drawn particularly from her biggest design influence, Pictish and Celtic artwork. She delves deep into the art of this period, reimagining the intricate interlacing knotwork patterns into a modern context. Alongside her self-published patterns, which can be found on her website, her work has been featured in many of the best-known knitting publications and magazines found on the market today. She's also the author and publisher of Celtic Cable Shawls, a collection of shawl patterns inspired by Pictish and Celtic art, which was released in 2015, and Illuminated Knits, a collection inspired by Celtic illuminated manuscripts released in October 2017. You can find more about her work on her website, which we'll put in the chat for you all to copy and you can explore later. We at Groam House have been lucky enough to work with Lucy already in 2019 in a project where she was one of 3 contemporary artists invited to work with our collections, reinterpreting Celtic art in a contemporary context. In her talk tonight, Lucy will be talking about one of the many special objects in the George Bain collection, one of the jumpers that Jill has just mentioned, knitted by George Bain's daughter, Claire. This object features in a recently launched project of which Groam House was a participant, called Highland Threads. This project brought 14 museums together in a richly visual digital exhibition exploring the stories of a range of Highland costumes, from an 18th century Spitalfield silk dress to a jacket and waistcoat purportedly belonging to Bonnie Prince Charlie, and from a Wick fisherman's Gansey to our wonderful Groam House jumper. You can enjoy some fabulous video and close-ups of all the costume, including our jumper, if you visit the website. And again, I'll pop that in the chat for you, highlandthreads.co.uk, sorry. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Lucy. Welcome to this evening, to the talk. We're all really looking forward to it. Over to you.
Brilliant, thank you. Thanks for that really lovely introduction. It's honestly such a pleasure to be speaking to you all tonight, and I just hope I can do you all justice. Just to begin with, I have been working mainly on key patterns recently, trying to make a sort of reinterpretation of this key pattern jumper that Helen just mentioned. I do have a swatch sort of in the making, which we're going to send out to you all. However, I've been having some terrible computer issues today, so it might be tomorrow. But in the meantime, what I've done is I've taken a couple of my hat patterns and I've put links to them on my website for you to download for free. So I'll just put that in the chat, and I'll put it back later if anyone else misses it. So I'm going to be talking about a couple of these hats. One is a sort of regular sort of interlacing knotwork style hat, which is one that I tend to recommend for beginners, particularly because it's quite a good introduction to the type of techniques that I use. And then the second one is a slightly more complicated key pattern hat, which uses some of the techniques that I'm going to be talking about today, which are specifically related to interpreting key pattern and cable knitting. Okay, so I've got a little presentation slide ready for you. So let's see if I can get the screen sharing to behave. I also must apologize because my window is right next to a busy street, so you might occasionally hear some some vehicles and things in the background, but hopefully nothing too distracting. Okay, there we go. I think you should be able to see my screen now. Right. And okay. Okay, yes, so as Helen mentioned in her introduction there, I am a designer of knitting patterns with a particular focus on cable knitting, and in particular interpreting Celtic and Pictish art through the medium of cable knitting. So my first book was Celtic Cable Shawls, which I published in 2015. That was really my first sort of foray into the world of trying to adapt Celtic patterns into cable knitting. I mean, it is something that people have done before, I should say. Like I'm definitely not the first person to have tried to do this. But I do have quite an obsession with trying to get things like really as perfect as possible and trying to be as authentic as possible to the original artwork. And, you know, I have to give a lot of credit to that to George Bain. I'm definitely a big fan of his, and like most of what I know about Celtic art and how to draw Celtic art comes from having read his Methods of Instruction, wonderful book. And in fact, actually for my first book as well, Celtic Cable Shawls, I did actually visit Groam House Museum and took photos of the stones there and did some research there. So it's lovely to kind of come full circle and be talking to you all now, so many years later. So that was my first book, and then my second book was Illuminated Knits, and that was published 2017. And so for that book, I was kind of taking a lot of the existing techniques I'd already been working with in my first book and the other designs I'd done since then. And I was trying to sort of elevate it a notch, again, sort of take it a bit further, both by sort of doing more complicated cable work, doing things that I maybe previously didn't know whether or not it was possible, and sort of trying to stretch myself a little bit. And then I also combined it with a very basic type of color work. Now, when I say color work, I don't mean the sort of thing that people usually think of when they think of knitted color work. This is basically a style of what's called mosaic knitting. So it's when you take two contrasting colors and work in stripes over each round. So you're changing the yarn each round. And if you slip stitches in certain ways, it basically makes this contrasting pattern, but it means that you don't have to strand the yarn the way that you would do if you were doing color work. So you don't have the floats of yarn going across the back in the same way that you would in color work. And it also makes it much easier to work as well, because you don't have to deal with some of the problems that you get with tension, for example, with color work, or you don't have to fiddle around with carrying two yarns at the same time, that kind of thing. So I felt this was a technique that really lent itself to cables. And again, this is something that already existed, but I sort of took it and tried to apply it to the more complicated styles of Celtic knitting. And a big part of my inspiration for that was illuminated manuscripts, hence the name Illuminated Knits. I just really wanted to try and find a way to sort of play around with color and kind of inject that into my work. So just to give you some examples of some of my more kind of knotwork influenced stuff, this is a cushion pattern that I did recently. And cable knitting is, I think it's really, really well suited to interpreting this kind of art, especially the sorts of things that you see on Pictish stones, because cable knitting has this amazing three-dimensional quality. And I find it quite fascinating, and I don't think there's really sort of anything else like it really in textiles. Part of the way that it works is as you're working, you are basically kind of twisting the fabric, the knitted fabric back on itself, and then you're sort of cementing that twist into the fabric. And if you do it in a very sort of methodical way over many rows, it builds up and you can create these amazing patterns. But of course, because of the nature of knitting, it's difficult to do anything sort of really free form with knitting. You have to plan everything out in advance, essentially. I'm assuming that most people in the audience are knitters, but if you're not a knitter, I'll try and give like a really sort of basic explanation. The way that hand knitting works anyway, is you are always working with rows of stitches. So at any given time, you will have a row of stitches on your needle. And these stitches are just loops of yarn, basically, which are held in place on the needle. And so for each row, you're working across the row, usually from right to left, and you're dealing with each individual stitch at a time. And then when that row is complete, you start again. And if it's flat knitting, you turn around and you go back the way you came. Or if it's circular knitting, you might be going around in a spiral. And you can do amazing things because you can create seamless tubes. You can basically make entirely three-dimensional objects without ever having to sew it together. So that's a really huge difference between knitting and, for example, woven fabric. Because with woven fabric, obviously you'll be working on a loom or something, and you have to rigidly determine the width of the fabric. You have to already decide in advance what that width is going to be, and then once you have that width, it's fixed, and then you're just going back and across weaving the fabric. But with knitting, you're working stitch by stitch, so you do have this ability to, like, you can add stitches into a row, or you can remove stitches, and you can make the fabric morph in quite interesting ways. But because it is row by row, if you're doing something like a really, really complicated Celtic pattern, you have to plan it all out in advance, because you're kind of looking at the thing sort of slice by slice. You can't sort of step back and see the whole until you've actually finished it. So it's very different to something like, you know, like drawing or something where you could just sort of sit down and you can, you know, start at any point on the page, and you can put more detail in a certain area or less detail in another area. With knitting, you have to have the entire plan worked out, and then once you have it worked out, you're going stitch by stitch, row by row, and you see the pattern kind of gradually emerging from the needles as you work, which is very satisfying. So that's basically what I do as a designer. I am the person who creates this plan for other people to follow, essentially. And I find that really rewarding, actually. I mean, I enjoy the process of making charts from cable knitting, which is something I'm going to try and sort of explain a little bit about my mindset behind it today, but it's actually quite a difficult thing for me to put into words. I didn't really realize until I sat down and thought about how do I actually explain what it is, what I do. I think I have a lot of sort of procedures kind of stored in my head that I've learned over many years of doing this, just through kind of trial and error. But actually finding a way to put that into words is surprisingly challenging, but I'll try. I've got some pictures of my notebooks and stuff, which I'll show you later on. So knotwork applies really well into knitting, and it's partly to do with the way that knitted stitches kind of flow. It's quite straightforward to make these nice kind of curving shapes. You do have to sort of finesse them a little bit and kind of stack the cables in certain ways, but it's something that translates very well. And key patterns are kind of one of the other major sort of forms of Celtic art and Pictish art. So knotwork, I'll just sort of try and explain the difference. Interlacing knotwork is when you have this pattern like the stone on the left here, where you have usually kind of curved shapes, so like arcs or circles and things, but overlaid on a sort of not visible grid, if that makes sense. So there's a sort of grid shape kind of underpinning it, but you don't actually see the grid. You just see the shapes of these arcs sort of superimposed on top of the grid. And then the very important thing is that there is this interlace, and it always goes alternating. So it's always over, under, over, under. So you never have, for example, two parts where it goes over twice or under twice. That would be considered a mistake. So that's knotwork, and that's kind of the main thing that people think about actually when they envisage Celtic art in their minds. And then the other thing, the main thing I want to talk about today, is key patterns. And key patterns are essentially rectilinear spirals, I think is probably the best kind of sort of explanation that I've heard from them. So they do follow similar paths to Celtic style spirals, but they are always in right angles. And they're actually usually on a grid which is tilted 45 degrees. So the example that I've put a picture here on the left, which I really love, is actually slightly more unusual because it's like a proper sort of right angled grid, but usually you'd see it on a kind of like a lozenge shaped grid, I think is the term for it. But I just wanted to include a photo of that one. I think that's the Woodray stone, because I really love how you have like all of the three major elements. You have knotwork at the top, and then it morphs into the key patterns in the middle, and then it goes kind of spirally at the bottom. So it's a very nice sort of illustration of the three sort of big parts of Celtic art, and that's something I would really love to explore in a future design, actually trying to do that morphing. I sort of attempted it a little bit in the design on the right there. That is my Kiramura shawl. And so the idea for that was basically exploring the relationship between key patterns and spirals. So I started with this key pattern chart, which I developed, and I wanted to see if I could kind of manipulate the cable stitches in such a way that it would gradually morph into the spiral, and then on the other side it morphs back into the key pattern again. So that's a really nice kind of tactile interpretation of the relationship between key patterns and spirals. I also have some pictures. In fact, two of these I think are actually from the stones in Groam House. So these are some nice detailed pictures of key patterns. So you can probably see the kind of main characteristics I'm talking about here. It's always really sharp angles. You don't have the same curves that you do with interlacing knotwork. And also you don't actually have any interlace. So the individual paths are never actually like looping over and under each other. They're kind of traveling around in this sort of labyrinth and like very, very closely, very tightly together, but never quite meeting. And the picture there on the top right-hand corner is from the Abelemno cross. And that's quite a lovely example of key pattern. That is a single strand key pattern, which relates to the George Bain jumper, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. So these are two examples of, these are the two hats, in fact, that I've given you a link to, if you'd like to download them and try them. So the one on the left is my Kinneok hat pattern. That's one of the first Celtic knotwork designs I ever did, actually. And this is one that I recommend to people who haven't done these kind of cables before and they're a bit scared and think it looks too difficult. I think it's quite a good introduction to how it all works. And like the way it's knitted as well, it's quite beginner friendly, I think, because you knit the hat band first, so you actually knit it like a headband basically. And because of this, you're knitting it back and forth, and the rows are very short. So if there's any point where you make a mistake, it's quite easy to kind of go back and fix it, which is, it's quite difficult to do that if you're doing anything with really long rows. So it's a nice beginner friendly pattern. And then the hat on the right there, that is one of my more recent designs, and that's when I really started to get into interpreting key patterns. So I want to talk about that I've kind of had to come up with, and like this is something I really like as a designer, is that I actually really like getting my teeth into things I haven't done before. So usually when I'm thinking about doing a new design, I specifically want to try and do something where I look at it and I think, I can't actually imagine how I would do that, because like that's part of the fun of it for me, is trying to find new ways to make these cables go in the directions that I want them to go in, basically. So what I'm currently working on, and I have some pictures of swatches and things which I'll show you shortly, is I am trying to make my own cabled version of this beautiful jumper designed by George Bain, which I've seen in the Groam House Museum. It's absolutely beautiful knitting, stunning knitting. So this is an example of colourwork knitting. So when I was speaking before about when you strand the yarn, this is an example of that. So if you were to turn this inside out and look on the back of it, you'd see lots of sort of floats of stranded yarn going across the back. But when you look at the front of it, it looks very smooth and flat. So this is kind of characteristic of colourwork knitting. And I almost think of it like colourwork knitting is kind of like the painting side of knitting, and then cable knitting is more like the sculpture side, because obviously with colourwork knitting, you're kind of treating the surface like it's a grid that you can fill in with individual points of colour, and that's how you depict a visual pattern, something like key patterns. Whereas with cables, you're actually manipulating the surface of the fabric so that it creates a three-dimensional effect. So what that means is something like colourwork knitting, it's more straightforward to translate a complicated pattern into something visual using colourwork knitting, right? So as an example, there is a colourwork chart here, which George Bain made. So you can imagine him sort of sitting down to translate this pattern into knitting. And it's kind of a case of just planning it out on the grid and colouring in the individual squares. So it has this technique. It's got advantages in the terms of the fact that it's easier to design for, I guess. But I'm always more drawn to the cables. I just love the textural kind of sculptural quality. However, certainly in terms of charting anyway, it's much more difficult. So I have an example here of, and this, by the way, is by no means one of my scariest looking cable charts. This is actually the chart that I developed for this talk, and also for the jumper. There are parts of this that I'll be using in the jumper as well. But I just wanted to sort of give you an idea of what my cable charts look like. Part of what makes the design process for this difficult. It's not so much the cables themselves, it's the fact that you need to use a lot of increases and decreases, and I'll kind of explain why in a minute. But when you do this in a knitted chart, it does make things a little bit harder to follow, because if you think about what a knitting chart actually is, you're looking at each square. So like if you were reading this as a knitter, you would start at the bottom right corner and you would go along each square right to left. And then if you're knitting flat, you would, on the next row, then you would go back left to right. So what the knitted chart is trying to show you is it's trying to give you a kind of representation of what the finished piece is going to look like. Obviously, it's not going to look exactly like it, but the idea is that you should be able to look at the chart and then look at your knitting and be able to kind of pinpoint where you are on the chart. However, what makes this complicated when you have increases and decreases is that you're introducing sort of ways that the stitches are moving, which is never going to map perfectly onto a grid. In fact, you can end up with quite wavy sort of distortions in the fabric. Maybe not so much for this pattern, but if you have a pattern that has a lot of increases and decreases going on, it ends up being something that doesn't make any sense on a grid. And then if you're trying to also show what the finished piece is going to look like, it just doesn't work at all. Everything ends up kind of in the wrong place and there's no sort of coherent flow to it. So you end up having to introduce these dark squares, which you can see here in this chart. These are called no stitch squares. So basically what that means is when you get to that as the knitter, you see this blank section and you skip it and you just don't do anything. So you just immediately kind of go on to the next stitch that isn't a no stitch square. So this helps from the point of view of the knitter who's actually working from the chart, but it can make things a bit confusing because it just means that like it makes things line up, but at the same time you end up with things kind of shifted away more than they otherwise would be, or more than they actually are in the finished piece, basically. So that can be a challenge. So basically, the point of me trying to explain this is that it's not as simple for me as just, I can't just draw the finished knot and then just translate it onto grid paper. There's always this process, long process of trial and error, where I chart something that I kind of think I know how it's going to turn out, but I'm not entirely sure. And then I knit the thing and then I compare it to the chart and I go back and forth, and I'm constantly kind of shifting things and trying to refine it, basically. And you know, that's all part of the fun of designing. So I'll try and explain exactly why we use these increases and decreases that I was talking about, because it might seem a bit counterintuitive. You know, why would you need to use this with cables? So how can I best explain this? I would probably begin to say that vertical braids, like I've pictured here, this is one of the simplest kinds of cable you can do. Very, very straightforward. The direction of the cable is it's following the direction of the knitting, so that makes it easier. If you ever have cables which are going kind of against the direction of the knitting, that's when things start getting a bit more tricky. So George Bain, in his methods of instruction, his I think one of the first things he shows you when he's talking about how to create just a simple knotwork band, like we have here, like I've created knitting here. He shows you how to sort of draw these intersecting circles, and then at various points he says that you should break the braid and then rejoin it. So that creates these breaks and then these loops on either side, and this is what begins to make up the shape of the Celtic knotwork. And it's kind of a similar idea in knitting, except because it's knitting, you're doing it row by row by row, and then there are certain points where you want two of these vertical strands to actually come together and then just vanish, because that's the end of the loop. And then you want some background fabric. And then you want to have another point where you suddenly have two of these strands springing out from a single point to make the base of another loop. So that's what I've shown here. So on the left, this is just like a regular kind of vertical braid. And then on the right, I've introduced some breaks and rejoins. And I've drawn over these just to try and make it a little bit clearer. And then on the right side, I've shown where these actual points are. where we're breaking and rejoining. Of course, we aren't actually like breaking or rejoining anything because we're working row by row. If you look at on the right side there, at the bottom, that first white dot, that's actually an increase. So you take one of the background stitches, so it would be a purl stitch if you're working on a reverse stocking stitch background. You take one of those purl stitches and you increase on either side so that you end up with 5 stitches. So you have 2 knit stitches, then 1 purl stitch in the middle, and then 2 knit stitches on the other side. And that's what becomes the base of this loop. And it creates this illusion that you have this break and then a loop. And actually, you know, it's all just knitting stitches. You haven't really sort of manipulated anything in that fashion, but it gives this illusion of a Celtic knot. And then similarly, if you look at the next little white dot above that, we do exactly the same thing in reverse. So it's taking 2 of those strands and then bringing them together with a decrease and then going back to the background fabric again. And so this is really the main kind of building block that you can use to add to cables in order to make Celtic knotwork. So it's a very, very powerful thing to be able to do. And I've actually got some videos which I'll try and show you, just showing these basic techniques. Just give me 1 second. Okay, I think that, sorry, I think we're getting there now. Okay, that's it. Okay, so this is the main pattern from that hat pattern that I showed you earlier, the one that I think is quite good for beginners. So I'm just going to show some very basic cables. If you're already a knitter, you're probably quite familiar with this, but it might be interesting to people if you've never actually seen cables being knitted before. And then I'm going to try and show you those decreases and increases that I just mentioned. Okay, so this is a basic right leaning cable. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take 2 knit stitches and I'm going to move them to the right over a background purl stitch. Okay, and I'm going to do this with a cable needle, and I should actually probably point out that I'm like really, really clumsy with a cable needle. Usually when I'm knitting, I prefer to do it without a cable needle, and I'll show you how I do that as well. I just find it a lot quicker, but that's just to explain if you're wondering why I'm fumbling around really, really awkwardly with my cable needle. So yes, so here we have, I've knitted up to the point where we have these 3 stitches, which I'm pointing at. So we have these 2 knit stitches. So the knit stitches are the ones that look like the little V's, and they sort of come forward in the fabric. And then the purl stitches here are part of the background fabric. They kind of recede. So we want to take those 2 knit stitches and move them to the right over this purl stitch. So the way that this works is actually quite straightforward. It just involves knitting the stitches out of order, so in a different order to how they actually appear on the left needle. And so the way this is normally done is with a cable needle, as I'm doing here. So I slip this background stitch off, and then I'm going to hold it at the back of the work. And that's just to kind of give it somewhere to stay whilst I'm working on these knit stitches. The thing with knitting is, if you ever take one of the stitches off the needle, you have to be really, really careful, because if you just let it drop, it can unravel all the way down. So you don't want that to happen. Okay, so I've knitted these first 2 stitches here, and then I go back to the cable needle, and then I'm just going to purl that stitch. And that's what creates this 2/1 cable stitch. Very straightforward. Now I also have, let's see if we can find it. I have a version of this as well, where I am doing this without a cable needle. So this is how I would perform this kind of stitch. So as I said before, it's dangerous to just leave a loop kind of hanging off the needle. But when you do this technique, you do briefly leave the loop hanging, but you have to pinch it at the base. And it's fine as long as you hold it at the base. So basically, hang on, I'm just going to go back here. So what I've done here is I've worked up to where these 3 stitches are. And when I do this method without a cable needle, the way that I do it is first to think of how many of the total stitches in the cable. So this is a 2/1 stitch. So there are 3 total stitches in the cable. So I begin by putting all 3 of those stitches, so everything that's involved in the cable, I'm going to put it all onto the right needle. And then I'm kind of using the left needle almost in place of the cable needle. So whereas with a cable needle, you would hold it at the back to create this, the rightwards movement over the background, you would hold the stitch to the back. So I'm going to come in from the back with the left needle. So that's a kind of easy way to remember it if you start learning how to do this and you're trying to like convert the instructions in your head. You just remember that it goes sort of in the same direction as the cable needle. So I'm going in from the back with the left needle, putting it into the purl stitch, and then this is the slightly terrifying bit. You pull the right needle out of those 2 knit stitches and also the purl stitch, so all together. And then you're going to pinch it at the base with your thumb so it doesn't unravel. And then you put it back into just those 2 knit stitches. And then when you put those 2 knit stitches back on the left needle, that's what creates the twist. So I like this method because, well, for me, I find it quicker. Maybe other people wouldn't. I mean, other people are much faster with a cable needle, so it just kind of depends what you're used to. But also, I do like the fact that it actually puts the twist visibly into the fabric before you start knitting it, so you can actually see it. So if there's a chance that you might get confused with your cables, you can already see the direction it's going before you've even knitted it, which I think is really helpful. Okay, so I have also a video of the decrease that I just mentioned, so I'll show you that. So at this point, this is what I was describing before, where you have these 2 strands which are coming together, and you want to decrease them into 1 stitch so that they kind of vanish into one another, and then above that you're going to have the background fabric. So the usual setup for this is what you see here. You have these 2 knit stitches, and then a purl stitch in the middle, and then another 2 knit stitches. And you can actually see this from looking at the pattern that you have these 2 strands coming together, which are about to meet. Now in this particular pattern, I'm going to do the decrease on the wrong side of the fabric. Other patterns, I'll have it on the right side, but this particular one, it's on the wrong side. So this is quite a straightforward maneuver. It's not too difficult. All you're doing is taking the middle stitch and alternately passing the stitches on either side over and off the needle. So they end up kind of wrapping themselves around this center stitch, and it makes this lovely neat effect. Okay, so I'm just working here up until the point in the pattern where this decrease begins. And at the point that I stop, so this is all kind of in reverse because we're looking at it from the wrong side, but you can see there's 2 purl stitches, 1 knit stitch in the middle, and then 2 other purl stitches. So the way that I would begin this is you want to slip the first 3 stitches to your right needle, so that the center stitch is the first stitch on your right needle. So there we go. Okay, so the center stitch is now the first stitch on the right needle, and I'm going to pass each stitch in turn over that center stitch and pass the center stitch back and forth. Okay, and that's what creates that decrease. And I will also show you the corresponding increase. Now this is the one that's a little bit more fiddly. So for this one, it's exactly the same thing, but it's in reverse. You're taking one of the background stitches and then you're making it into 5 stitches. So the way you do that is actually a bit like the cable cast on, if you've ever heard of it. Confusingly, the cable cast on has got nothing to do with cables, so I don't know why it's called that. But the way that it works is you actually put the needle in between 2 of the stitches on the needle, and you pull the yarn in between, like I'm doing here. But with the cable cast on, you would do that sequentially, sort of stitch by stitch, one after the other. With this increase, you're continuously slipping the central stitch from the left needle to the right needle and then back again. So you're making an increase on each side, and you're doing that 4 times. So after you've done that 4 times, you end up with the extra 5 stitches. The reason it's particularly fiddly, I think, is this part when you have to put the left needle in between the stitches on the right needle, wrap the yarn, and then pull it through. And that feels very alien if you've never done it before. It's quite a strange maneuver, because usually in knitting, you're always, well, if you're a right-handed knitter anyway, you're always wrapping the yarn around the right needle and pulling it through stitches on the left needle. So you have to do a tiny bit of reverse knitting for this technique to work. But I think it's very, very worthwhile, and it provides a kind of perfect match to this 5 into 1 decrease. So another thing which is quite handy about this actually is that when I'm charting knot work, I always find that the number of 1 into 5 increases always match the number of 5 into 1 decreases, always. And I presume I guess it's due to the sort of inherent symmetry in knot work. But that's a very sort of useful serendipitous kind of fact, because it means that I don't have to worry too much about ending up with, you know, the wrong number of stitches, or too many stitches, or too few stitches, for example. Okay, so I'm just going to go back to my slides. Okay, keep it there. Okay, so this is a sketch that I've made of the key patterns which are on this amazing jumper that George Bain designed. Now, usually whenever I'm going to do a new table chart, make a new design, I always like to draw it. In fact, I kind of feel like I have to draw it almost. It kind of helps me sort of get a handle on the general shape of what I'm working with. It helps me understand it better. And it also helps me to plan. This is probably the most important part, to plan where all the increases and decreases are going to fall within the pattern. And in addition to that, it helps me to figure out which parts of the pattern actually repeat, because of course this is a really important thing in knitting, just by the nature of how it operates. And you know, you can tessellate things. So tessellating is when you have a pattern that can repeat infinitely in any direction. So knitting is very well suited to things that tessellate. And the way that I would write the instructions for something, if it's got a large all over pattern that breaks down into smaller patterns, is you want to find kind of the smallest possible repeat, and give that as instructions for the knitter to follow. So this was my attempt at trying to sort of decipher the knotwork on this jumper. So I managed to break it down after looking at it for a bit, looking at photos of it. And it appears to be as a type of single strand key pattern. So this is when you have a key pattern that doesn't connect in the middle, it kind of terminates. So it's similar to some of the key patterns on the Aberlemno cross slab, for example. And the way that I kind of figured out how to draw it after looking at it for a bit and consulting George Bain's books to try and remind myself of how to draw key patterns, is that it's a series of, appears to be a series of interlocking S and Z shapes. And I've actually made a small, let's see if this works. I tried to make a small animation of me drawing it so you could actually see what I mean. Let's see if this works. Okay, I think that should be working. Okay, I hope so. Okay, so S and Z shapes interlocking. So I'm going to start with the S shapes. And it's the same for each of the S shapes. They're all going to be the same size and they interlock, and each edge is always going to be the same in each of the S shapes. Anyway, I'll show you and hopefully it'll make sense. So you start with an edge which is 1 grid square long. And as you can see, by the way, I'm using this grid paper that I was talking about before, where it's actually kind of on a tilt. It's on a 45-degree tilt, rather than being like normal straight grid paper. Oops. Okay, so we start with 1, and then 2, and then 3, then 4, and then you have the longest branch of the S, which is 9, and then it goes back on itself in the same shape. So it goes 4, 3, 2, 1. So that is the basic unit, even though it looks nothing like the finished pattern, but as you build it up, it starts to make more sense. So then you start with another S, which interlocks with the first one, and it's the same, exactly the same size and the same number of edges. So we have the 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 9, and then 4, 3, 2, 1. So you can see that the way that this interlocks is very vertical. We haven't introduced any sort of horizontal action yet, but I'll show you that in a minute. So you can add in more S's up or down the way. So you make this horizontal strip. And then you start adding in the Z scrolls. So this is exactly the same shape as the S, but it's just like a mirror image flipped. And it fits in perfectly with the S's that you've just drawn. And the way that I find it easiest to think about this is to actually start with the longest part first, because you know that that's going to be 9 squares long, like it is on the S scrolls. So we start with that, and then we go off in either direction with the 4, 3, 2, 1, 4, 3, 2, 1. And then just like the S's, these stack in sort of on top of each other in exactly the same way. So at this point, it starts to look a little bit more like key patterns. Then once you have that, you can add in more S's, vertical rows of S's, and then another vertical row of Z's, so on and so forth. And that starts to give you the actual sort of skeleton of the key pattern. Now, when it's in this form, it's still kind of hard to actually look at it and see that it's a key pattern. But once you start shading in one of the branches, which I started doing here, this is when it actually starts to look like the pattern on the jumper. So after I'd kind of figured all that out, I was thinking about how to deal with the edges. Now the jumper is quite interesting because as far as I can tell from photos, I haven't actually examined it myself. I think it's kind of knitted all in the round, or at least it's knitted in such a way that there doesn't need to be vertical edges in the key pattern. I think it just wraps around continuously, which of course is something you can do with a pattern like this. That's one of the beauties of a tessellating pattern, is you can just sort of go infinitely in any direction. However, for my jumper, I was thinking more about ways that I could introduce shaping and just try and make something that has a bit more shape to it and a bit more ability to be customized, is kind of what I was thinking about. This is a very important thing, I think, about knitting, is that you can, because you are basically making the fabric yourself, you can take something like a pattern for a jumper and you can modify it for your own needs. You know, maybe you're a bit shorter than normal or a bit taller than normal, or anything like that. You can actually change some of the things just by altering the stitch counts yourself. However, if I was to make a pattern where it was just a tube of tessellating key patterns all the way around, that would make it quite difficult for a knitter to change if they wanted to. They could only change it in sort of blocks by adding more repeats or taking away repeats. So what I want to do with this jumper is I want to have the ability to have straight edges along the edges of the key patterns, so that I can have that probably sort of along where the seam would be in the arm, and also down the sides of the body. So what that will mean is that there will be a sort of natural break in the pattern, so that if a knitter wants to add more stitches or take some stitches away and just add a bit of shape, and also for the sleeve shaping as well, I think that'll make it easier. So the way that you add edges in key patterns, I'll be honest, I still don't entirely understand it, but I think the way that it works is that you draw lines, vertical lines, and you try to sort of bisect each of these little spiral units, and then you follow the pattern with your eye, and you kind of bend the unit back on itself when it meets the edge. It's quite difficult to sort of verbally describe, but hopefully the pictures kind of make some sense. So the way that I've tried to sort of get my head around this is doing it all in pencil and then going over it afterwards in ink once it makes more sense to me. So this is my attempt at making a unit of key pattern with edges. I've started to draw the edges in and then started to ink it in. So you can see here it has this quite characteristic shape when it meets the bottom edge and it bends back on itself like this. And that is present in the George Bain jumper. That is something that I'm going to try to replicate. However, this poses an interesting challenge because if you imagine knitting this, imagine this sort of vertically, you're knitting it horizontally row by row. If you get to a section like this, it means that you basically have to do a horizontal cable. And this is a technique that I've been working on, and I do actually have a way of doing it. However, it's the real sort of difficulty that I'm running into is it's not so much the actual execution of it, it's trying to find a way to describe it to people and actually write it out in a knitting pattern and in a chart as well, in a way that's going to make sense to people and not be immensely confusing. So that is something I'm working on, and I am hoping to be able to actually do that in this jumper pattern, because I know it is possible. So the real challenge is going to be to sort of try and find a way to actually describe it, but I'm getting there. So just to continue this is my I'm filling in the rest of the key patterns here, so that at this point I have something I can actually look at and kind of visualize myself knitting. So I would see, for example, the places where there need to be increases and the places where there need to be decreases. And then, as I just said, the places where I might have to do some scary horizontal cables. Once I have it all kind of mapped out like this, is a lot clearer. So the next thing I would do after I have this kind of properly drawn out is I would try to find repeats. Like I said before, I want to try and find the smallest possible unit that will tessellate. So I can just write that out and then you can sort of repeat it infinitely as a knitter. So the way that I did this was to kind of look at the shape and pick 2 points where I can see that there was a repeat. So for example, where this unit kind of spirals back on itself, and there's this pointy bit. It's very hard to describe verbally, but hopefully you can see what I mean. And then just drawing a vertical line through that and then matching it with the next one, so I can see that is one unit. So that's like a vertical unit, which I know that I could repeat in horizontal sections. And then I try to find the other type of repeat, which is this one, and then that becomes the smallest possible unit. Okay, so if you were just to take this section here in black and just to repeat it either way, you could do it horizontally, you could do it vertically, you would get an entire field of endlessly repeating key pattern. But then when you want to also do the edges, like I was talking about before, both the vertical edges and the top and the bottom edges, you would obviously need to make different cable charts for those to allow that to happen. And so for the swatch that I've made, what I've done is I've just combined the, sorry, I just need to go back to my slide. Okay. Yes. What I've done is I've combined the beginning edge and the end edge, and I've actually left out the main repeating section in the middle. And the main reason I did that was just because I was trying to make this swatch as small as possible, essentially. So my reasoning behind that was for someone who hasn't done these kinds of techniques before, you can actually sort of try out all of the techniques just using the beginning chart and the end chart. They actually contain all of the stitches that are also in this central repeating section. And also you can see that if you join up the beginning chart and the end chart together, they do actually, they fit together perfectly. You don't actually need to have this this big wide section in the middle, and it just makes it a bit quicker as well if you just want to sort of quickly try out the techniques, essentially. Okay, so the techniques I showed you before with the knot work, many of these also apply to key patterns, but then there are some additional sort of new ones that I've kind of had to invent as well. So you can probably see if you look at this this small sort of schematic key pattern sketch that I've made here, and if you try and imagine knitting it and sort of go vertically up it with your eyes, kind of slice by slice, you start to see that there are sections where things kind of appear suddenly out of the background. So that would be a section where you need to put an increase. And then similarly, there are sections where things kind of disappear into the background. So that's where you'd need to put a decrease. And then also there's the horizontal sections, which I've talked about before. And then we have an entirely new thing, which doesn't exist in knotwork, which is these kind of branching shapes. So if you kind of follow the pattern up vertically with your eye, you can see that there's a sort of central branch that kind of zigzags its way, and then each end terminates in one of these little spirally units, but there is sort of underpinning that, there's this branching shape. So you have sections where, like if you imagine knitting this, you have a cable strand which is just moving along as normal, but then it needs to actually cross over, but at the same time split into entirely new cable strand. And also correspondingly, you have one that goes the opposite way, although not so much in this pattern, but you do have it in the end edge chart, where you have the sort of upside down branching thing. So it's like the branching thing that I just mentioned, but it's upside down instead of pointing upwards. So knitting that means that you'd have to take two cable strands and bring them together and decrease them together. So essentially what these are, they're kind of similar to the increases and decreases that I showed you earlier, in the sense that we're trying to make these new cable strands kind of come out of nowhere or disappear back into nowhere. But we're trying to do it at the same time as doing a cable. So the way that we do that is simply to do a cable stitch, but also incorporate some increases or decreases at the same time. So I have some videos of this, which I'll try and show you if I can get them up. Okay. And that is not the right video, sorry, hang on. Yes, okay. So this is an example of a cable that we want to move over 3 background stitches, and then we also want to branch off into another direction at the same time. So the way that I do this is I treat it kind of like a normal 5-stitch cable, what I would call a T5L. So it involves 5 stitches, and then 2 of them are moving over 3 background stitches to the left. So I'm starting exactly the same way that I would for that, and holding 2 of the knit stitches at the front with the cable needle. But then in these background stitches, so in a normal T5L, these would just be purled stitches. I would purl 3 and then I would knit 2 from the cable needle. But I want to introduce 2 new additional stitches. So in the very first stitch, I'm going to knit it, but then I'm also going to knit into the base of it. So that's 1 increase. You end up with 1 extra stitch there, which I appear to be redoing, I suppose, because I must have made a mess of it the first time. And then I'm going to make a second, which I appear to have stopped recording, but then there's a second increase basically in one of the purl background stitches. So you end up with a situation where you've crossed over 3 of the background stitches at the same time as increasing 2 stitches as well. And then there's the corresponding cable decrease to that, which I think should be this one. Yeah. Okay, so this is when we're taking 2 of the cable strands, so they have a 3-stitch gap in between them, and we want to move the 2 knit stitches which are on the far left, we want to move them over those 3 background stitches, and then when they meet up with those other 2 knit stitches, we want to perform a decrease so that it has the effect of appearing to swallow up that other cable strand, and then the original cable strand just continues on its way. So the way that I would do that is to begin by just slipping those 2 knit stitches so they're out of the way, because we don't need to use them until we've actually done the cable. So then I'm performing this like a normal T5R. So I'm holding those 3 purl stitches at the back. And then with these 2 knit stitches here on the left, what I'm going to do is actually decrease them with the knit stitches that were held on the right. So the first of those 2 knit stitches on the left gets knitted together, so it's like a knit 3 together decrease, and then I just finish the rest of the stitches I would a normal cable. So I'm going to purl the 3 background stitches, and so the effect that has is that cable strand on the left has kind of swallowed up the cable strand that was on the right. And it produces, yes, this kind of effect, almost like a T shape. So that's very, very characteristic in key patterns. And this corresponds to the increase as well. So they kind of balance each other out, as it were. So let me just go back to my slides. Okay. So I have some pictures of early attempts at making this key pattern, some of which are quite messy, I'm afraid to say, but I thought I might as well show you them anyway. This is kind of part of my whole design philosophy, is when I think about designing something, especially if something I haven't done before or something I haven't done for a while maybe, I try to think of it in terms of failing successfully, which I know sounds quite funny, but basically, like anything with knitting, it's so time consuming to knit. It's a very, very slow craft, and it's almost more of a waste if you only get halfway through something and then you get frustrated because you think it doesn't look right, so you just stop and unravel it and then just start again. That's actually a waste in terms of designing, because sometimes you can get a lot more useful information out of a swatch that actually looks really wrong, because you know, it's a starting point at least. And if you keep all of your existing charts, which I do, as you can see, I have these notebooks which are filled with lots of horrible scribbly charts, but I keep them all. And so if I know which of my swatches, which one corresponds to, I can look back on it and I have a reference point then, because like as I was talking about before with cable charts, it's really, really difficult to actually visualize how something's going to look. You can definitely get it correct just in terms of where the main points of it are going to be. That's quite straightforward to do, but the actual intricacies of it and how you actually manage all of the cable stitches in relation to each other is a very, very difficult undertaking. So if you have something, even if it's something quite sort of misshapen looking, if you know that some of it's in the right place, then you can use that as a reference point in the future to sort of continuously adjust it and refine it and go back and actually see what needs to be changed and see what's good and could be kept. So that's a huge part of my process. And oh yes, I want to talk about this as well, because this was something that stumped me for a while, because as I showed you before, I wanted these nice straight edges for the key pattern. And this is quite a good example of an instance where I charted something and it looked absolutely fine on paper and it made sense, and the increases and decreases balanced out, so it wasn't like there was, you know, extra stitches anywhere or anything like that. But I just couldn't get the edge to actually remain in the straight line, right? And I know that it probably looks fairly straight from this photograph, but I'm a major perfectionist about these kinds of things, and it was actually driving me mad that I couldn't get it to sort of lie straight. And after I thought about it for a while, I had to really kind of think about what the stitches were actually doing and what the fabric around the stitches was doing. This is a really important thing in knitting. If you have increases and decreases, even if they balance each other out over a series of rows, if you don't have them sort of directly next to each other, it means that the underlying fabric is a little bit wavy. And sometimes you can use that to your advantage, like if you're doing it deliberately and you kind of know the direction that the underlying fabric is going in, it can actually be helpful. But I think in this instance, I just hadn't kind of properly accounted for it. And I hadn't realized that, you know, even though it looks straight on paper, but when you actually put it into practice, it introduces all these underlying forces which start to just make the stitches become a little bit more kind of curved than I wanted them to be. So this is what I ended up with. So I realize that does not look like a major difference, but this is the type of thing that I lose sleep over trying to fix. So the way that I eventually fixed this was to basically look at where the increases and decreases were, and to try and put in some extra additional sort of compensatory increases and decreases. So there's points here where, like, for example, the decrease I just showed you, with the cable strand sort of moving to the right and then swallowing up that other cable strand, putting some more increases on either side of it, even though it's part of the background fabric, actually helps to balance it out. And there's other points there where I've had to increase or decrease as part of the cable pattern, and then I've actually added in things in the background. So it's something that you'd never notice if you actually looked at it. If you were knitting it, you might be thinking to yourself, oh, why on earth am I having to do this this random increase or decrease in the background fabric? But that's the reasoning behind it. Essentially, it's to sort of balance out some of the forces that are going on in the background fabric, and to try and make things sort of lie straight and even, essentially. So I think I might take some questions now, if anyone would like to take some questions, or if you'd like me to maybe explain anything in any more detail, I'd be happy to do so.
That was absolutely fantastic, Lucy. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for having me. It's a real honor.
So I'm just going to just start off the questioning. I've done cable work a lot in the past, but this has been fascinating both in reminding me sort of the basic principles, but also in seeing the complexity of actually working out how to create this sort of cable design as opposed to a straightforward Aran or whatever. It has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you.
Oh, I'm glad you enjoyed it. Yes, there was something else I didn't really mention there as well, but something that causes me a lot of issues when I'm designing is if you're trying to refine something and you move one thing, it obviously has like a domino effect on all of the surrounding stitches. So there's often cases where I'm trying to fix sort of a tiny area, and then I end up having to, shuffle things around even more to kind of match up with where all the stitches are meant to be. So yeah, it's quite a puzzle, really, but it's a lot of fun.
So could you take off your screen sharing, and then we'll be
sorry.
able to see if anybody's got their hands up, and that would be grand.
I thought I had. I'm sorry.
Okay, no worries. So in the chat, we've got a question from Katie Barkwood, which is, do you find that different types of yarn affect the way the cable patterns do or don't work?
They can definitely affect how visible the cable pattern is. I think that's the main one. They don't tend to, they wouldn't really distort the pattern too much unless you're knitting it at a drastically different gauge or tension. So that just means the relationship of how wide the stitches are to how high the stitches are. So as long as you're close to that, you'll get something that sort of turns out the same kind of dimensions and angles and things. But there are certain types of yarn, like if you use a yarn that's very fuzzy, for example, obviously the fuzziness will kind of obscure the stitch pattern a little bit. If you use something that's single ply, sometimes it just doesn't kind of show the stitches as well. Also, the color is a big one, and people don't always think about this. If you use a yarn that's too dark, it won't always show the cable pattern, because part of what's giving it that definition is the fact that there is this three-dimensional aspect. So you actually need to see the shadows that are being cast by the stitches. So if you were to use like a dark or black yarn or something, you wouldn't see as much definition. But the actual type of yarn, like the fiber itself, I don't think makes too much difference. No.
And there's one from Rebecca. Why did you decide to take on the challenge of translating the jumper in the first place? Why this particular project?
Well, I think that was an idea I actually got from talking to Helen, because she got in touch with me and asked me if I'd like to do this lecture, and just if I had any ideas about kind of specific things that I wanted to talk about. And I'd already been quite interested in key patterns for a while. That's kind of what I've been thinking more about recently, because I kind of feel like I've got to the stage where I still really enjoy design. Speak Lucy. I still love designing knotwork, but it's something that I kind of have the toolbox in my head for now. So I sort of know how to do it. It's easier for me to do. So there maybe isn't quite as much of a challenge in that as there is in doing key patterns, because key patterns are still quite mind-boggling to me. So yeah, I think Helen asked me to do this talk, and then I think she mentioned about the beautiful key pattern jumper, and that gave me the idea to try and make it in cable knitting. And it just, I think it's an interesting comparison to sort of compare it to how you would go about designing it in a colourwork pattern to how you would design it to make it in cables. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in here because I am absolutely blown away, Lucy. Fantastic talk. And I think someone's put in the comments and the chat just your generosity of spirit in sharing all the knowledge and experience that you've gained over the years of your creative practice. To share it with everybody is just, so generous. So yeah, thank you so much. And for me personally, who, being involved with the Highland Threads project and the George Bain jumper, to see it interpreted in a really new and different, exciting way, it's just fantastic. So yeah, I want to say kind of personally from Groam House, but also from the Highland Threads project, just thank you so much for all that you've given all of us tonight. I think it's wonderful.
You're very really welcome.
So we've got if you don't mind, we've got 2 more questions.
Oh yeah, sure. Go ahead.
One of your patterns so in some of your patterns you use different colours to highlight cables. How do you do that? It's beautiful.
Now I'm not sure if I have any pictures to show you, but basically if you've ever done mosaic knitting, it's similar to the idea behind that. So if you're doing mosaic knitting like without any cables involved, you would use 2 different colours, and you would swap the yarn either on every round if you're knitting circularly, or you can swap it every 2 rounds if you're knitting flat. So if you imagine you have like a yarn A and a yarn B, and you knit a yarn A round, and then when you switch and you knit a yarn B round, if you slip some of the yarn A stitches and hold the yarn at the back instead of working for them, it means that those stitches are kind of left on hold. So they just sit there on the needle, kind of at the front of the work, and the working yarn goes behind them. And then when you go back to the yarn A on the next round or the next row, and then you work it, it means that it stands out in contrast against the yarn B, because it never gets worked with the yarn B essentially. So I just took that idea and I just applied it to cables basically. So it's absolutely the same idea as mosaic knitting. It's just that some of the slip stitches happen to be also involved in cables, so they're moving across the work at the same time as being slipped, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. So within the chat, there are some lovely comments for you, yes. And I hope you enjoy. I hope you enjoy them. We've certainly got time for one more question. If anybody has got one.
I'll also post my link again in case anyone didn't see it before.
Thank you.
Okay, I think that should work. So if you click on that link, you should be able to download those 2 patterns I was talking about, and that'll give you a chance to play around with these techniques if you haven't done them before.
Right. Well, if nobody else has got a question, she says openly. I think
from the sound of the comments, everyone's away to start knitting. Everyone's fingers to get knitting. So
that's what I like to hear.
So I would just like to, on behalf of Groam House Museum, I'd just like to thank you, Lucy, for a wonderful evening. It's been fascinating. It's a culmination of a Celtic Stitches in Time part of our George Bain project, of getting things up on the web so that people can take inspiration from George Bain and his knitting charts, and actually in this instance his knitting charts, and actually see what they can do in changing things, developing their own designs, and we'll see where that goes. But thank you ever so much for a wonderful evening, and in time-honoured fashion.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you ever so much.
Thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure.